don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Welcome back, and thanks for joining. I do appreciate it. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce this week's episode. A reminder that we have two websites. WeGrowTeachers.com has all of our professional development offerings, project-based learning, inquiry, differentiated instruction, and our objective pluralism work if you are looking for help in navigating the culture war nonsense that many schools are now subject to. You can also find our blogs and this podcast there, as well as some other resources, and ThoughtStretchers.org, which is our community, of which this episode was a discussion that was hosted as a part of. And speaking of this episode, it was an online discussion that was hosted as part of that community on May 25th with Kath Murdoch, who is an inquiry advocate and author and professional development provider. Her latest book is From Agency to Zest, A Journey Through the Landscape of Inquiry. And we talked about that and lots of other pieces around the idea of teaching and learning and inquiry with Kath and a group of ThoughtStretchers Education Community members. And so you'll hear their voices as well. It's always a pleasure to talk with Kath, and I appreciate her joining us once again. As you'll hear, she has been on the podcast several times. And with that said, here is that discussion with Kath and our community members. Thank you all for joining, and obviously to Kath for giving up her time and her expertise. We're going to talk about inquiry and, of course, the book that she's most recently put out, From Agency to Zest. And Kath has given up time before and been on our podcast. It's always a pleasure to have her on. So my name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of ThoughtStretchers Education. We used to be Teach Thought, PD, but we have changed the name as of last year, and now we're aiming to stretch people's thinking, which of course is inquiry, consistent with inquiry. We do lots of professional development around the world, not as much in that hemisphere and down there, but we're actually going to be in Mumbai doing some differentiation work soon. And we do get around a little bit, but mostly in the United States. I always say everything's through the lens of inquiry. We do a lot of project-based learning work and differentiated instruction, getting into AI in PBL, some interesting things there that I think are inquiry related as well. And then, of course, the ThoughtStretchers Education Community, which is meant to give us an opportunity to have conversations like this. So this is a little bit different book for you, and I'm curious, how did that idea come up? And you have A to Z and letters and words that are associated with it, and then one of my favorite things in the back, the beautiful questions piece. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book and the what and the why and those kinds of things.
Oh, sure. Well, firstly, thanks for having me on, Drew. It's always a delight to talk with you in this very select group on a Sunday morning. And I also want to just say that the concept behind the ThoughtStretchers community is one that is really important at the moment. I see that community as a community that stands for inclusion of ideas and having really respectful and deep conversations about learning. It's a community committed to nuance rather than polarization of ideas, and boy, do we need that right now.
Boy, do we.
So thank you for getting it going, and I hope that it's in the very early stages, I know, but I really hope that it flourishes and that we hold on to our capacity as educators to think broadly and, as I say, with nuance and subtlety and inclusion and respect, because it's the only way that we're going to continue to grow. Mm-hmm. So this little book came about, it's been out for a while now, but it had its genesis in a journal. The year before last, I was doing my first really long trip away from my grown-up children, but a really long, it was a month of professional learning away. It was in fact, not quite a month, it was 26 days. And I'm a journaler, and I started to write something each day and then realised, hang on a second, 26. There are 26 letters in our alphabet. So long story short, I started posting each day an idea, a concept associated with inquiry, beginning with a different letter of the alphabet and a photograph to go with it and a reflection, often kind of riffing on what I was experiencing over that journey. And look, it really came about as it was almost kind of a crowdsourced idea without it meaning to be, because people were saying, I really love this, you should make this a book. Anyway, so I did. And then I played with it a little more, added other words. And what it's become really is if I think about all the books that I've written, in some ways this acts as a little overview book. And it's small, but it provides the umbrella that the other more practical and detailed books sit underneath. And I called it a journey through the landscape of inquiry, because it denotes something very broad and something with lots of diversity in that landscape, as most landscapes are. And it's just an attempt to capture the essence. It's not a practical, here's some stuff to do in the classroom book. It's designed to provoke thinking. So I've used it in workshops a lot since, just to think about what are some of the main ideas that sit around this thing we call inquiry.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from, and that's what it is.
Well, and I'm going to ask the folks who are here to ask some questions and participate more than I'm asking questions, hopefully. But I do have a few before we sort of open that up. So you said it's not like this is do this in your classroom, that kind of thing. But one of the things I like in the back here is using this with your team. So some creative strategies. And I'm curious, I mean, I couldn't count them, I could, but I'm not going to count them up, the bullet points and ideas. Have you seen, because it's been, it was, the copyright is 2023, so it's been out a little while. Have you seen, you're using in workshops, but what have you seen schools and teachers and maybe admin, school leaders, that kind of thing, using it? Yeah. How are they using it?
It's been really sweet, actually. Mainly like coordinators, leaders, people running professional learning and meetings within schools, using it as like a little provocation at the beginning of a staff meeting. They might take one of the words and get people to read it and then connect to it and connect to their thinking and their classroom practice around it. At the beginning of the year, to kind of set the scene, and is particularly where I've seen it being used is mostly in my partner schools that have already embraced a philosophy of inquiry as a kind of underpinning principle for their work. So they've used it to engage in conversations about and grapple with what it means to them, and also to try and bring multiple perspectives. So they might take one of the concepts like, what am I looking at? So the concept of facilitation. So that's one of them, is facilitation. And then using it just as a starting point to say, well, we hear this phrase all the time, that in an inquiry-based approach, the teacher's role is as facilitator, and it's sometimes used to criticise inquiry. But what does that mean to us? What does the word facilitation mean? What does it mean to facilitate learning? And so, using it in that way. I think the main way I've seen it used is as a spark for dialogue.
Gotcha. Well, a couple other questions, and then I'm going to try to turn it over, and folks, you can just do the raise your hand, or we probably actually, you can unmute and just talk if you want. One of the things, and I'll be doing an inquiry workshop next week in Colorado with a bunch of teachers, and one of the challenges tends to be, and I have all these conversations and hopefully dialogue, but sometimes it doesn't feel much like dialogue about the spectrum of instructional approaches. And people say, well, we know what, this means, but what does inquiry learning mean? What does inquiry-based learning mean? And I'm curious, how you define it, and you said sort of philosophy, embrace that philosophy. What does that mean? How do you articulate that?
Well, when, of course, I get that question also.
Sure.
And I have a collection of about 35 different definitions and explanations from various researchers over decades. And one of the things I like to do is to give people that collection and get them to scan, like each one is just a little paragraph, and get people to scan them and then start to look for what are some of the common elements here. Because defining inquiry is, and this is a very annoying answer, but I'm going to say it anyway, it's a little like trying to put an elephant into a matchbox. It's because in many ways inquiry it's a philosophy, so it's a way of being as an educator. It's a approach to teaching where you see your role as facilitator and where you position the way your to borrow the Reggio phrase, your image of the child is as a competent, capable, curious learner with a right to own their learning. So it's a philosophy, it's a way of seeing and a way of being. It's also a pedagogy, so it's also an approach to teaching that is unashamedly built on the foundations of a constructivist view of learning, that the learner is the one that is building the understanding. And I would say it's also an approach to designing. So where things like a cycle of inquiry come in is that it's a way in which we think about how to design learning experiences that give the students more ownership, more opportunity to figure more things out for themselves more of the time. So you've got this philosophy element or the kind of stance, the way of being. You've got you've got the learning theory, and then you've got the design and the pedagogy piece. But I think overall it's an approach that is that recognises the student as a capable, curious learner, and that is built around the idea that when we are curious and when we lean into when as teachers we lean into the wonder and the curiosity and the desire that the learner has, and we help design learning experiences that grow from there, then we've got really high quality engagement, and the learner's the one doing the learning. Rather than I'm going to do the learning to you. The other piece I want to say that just to add to the complex definition is it's also an approach that for me recognises the importance of education, the importance of what happens in the classroom being about building what Guy Claxton calls learning muscle. So growing deliberately and explicitly acknowledging school as a place in which you don't just learn about stuff, you learn about yourself as a learner, and you grow through your learning experiences at school, your capacity to be a learner for life, to know what to do when you don't know. So the dispositions and the skills, what Claxton calls learning powers, what I call learning assets, what the IB calls a learner profile and approaches to learning. To me, that's one of the things that is a hallmark of strong inquiry-based approaches, is it takes on that purpose of school alongside the stuff that is in the curriculum.
Yeah.
That was a really long answer. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it gets to my next question. And again, I want to hear from the other folks here, and please start formulating your questions, because I want to stop talking and listen a little bit and learn. But, the complexity of inquiry learning and then how we measure and quantify it, that's a really, I think, challenging piece in that dialogue. I like the framework that John Hattie, puts on offer of surface, deep, and transfer learning. And, surface knowledge and learning tends to be pretty easy to measure and quantify. That's tests and scores, and we're all familiar with that. Deep transfer certainly is measurable, but some of the things that we're after, intellectual virtues and characteristics and mindsets and those kinds of things, are so much less quantifiable, and it makes it difficult to sometimes brook that gap between folks who are really sort of focused on surface knowledge and we'll go ahead and say it, science of learning kinds of thing, which you and I were talking about before we hit record. That whole thing it's become boring in some ways, but certainly is a fire that continues to flame. So I guess I'm curious. I know there's been some recent, like I think you mentioned Guy Claxton. I think has written something recently that was inflammatory to that crowd that is in the science of learning. What are you seeing, and kind of where are you on what you're seeing in inquiry and education? If you want to comment on any of the things that Guy has written, I know you're close or a big fan of his. And then also, like, how do you sort of address that difficulty or challenge and maybe you don't agree that it's that the sort of inquiry based learning outcomes are a little bit more challenging to measure, I guess.
Oh, there's a lot in that, Drew. I asked Guy to write that piece. We had I think with the growing movement in Australia at the moment, with some very loud voices championing a thing that they call the science of learning, which actually there is no such thing as the science of learning. There are sciences of learning, multiple sciences of learning, multiple ways that researchers think about and suggest the science behind learning, whether we go from psychology or whether it's so much more complicated and complex than what is presented. But anyway, because of that and some of the stuff that was coming out, I just was talking to Guy via emails about various things, and I said, I think that this would be a really good blog post, and we need your clear, brave, pragmatic, and well-informed voice in this conversation. So it was a very welcome post, and there's been, in fact, a blog post I wrote about the same thing. I've continued just to add at the bottom of that blog post a bunch of other articles and so on, where people have, I think, done a really good job of addressing this current obsession with the science of learning. So there's plenty out there to explore it. I mean, I think, your question about the measurement of outcomes, of course, one of the things that I want to say, which is, again, another annoying response, is why our obsession with measurement and our obsession with even the whole idea of, I want to say growth, upward growth, rather than building the whole person, and that the idea of the role of the learner in thinking about and tracking their own growth. I actually think that firstly, I want to say, when you were talking about inquiry outcomes, here in Australia, in the Australian curriculum, we actually have in what teachers are expected to attend to in the curriculum, we have what we call general capabilities. And I was looking at the refreshed version of those the other day, and they include things like critical and creative thinking, personal and social skills, and they even, in the latest version of the curriculum, there's quite a nice progression of those skills that really help teachers know, what am I looking for as a child grows in their capacity to demonstrate something like that we might call creative thinking. So if we want to use the word measurement, the support is there, and it's actually in our national curriculum to, if you like, measure or at least track some of those things that we might associate more with an inquiry-based way of working. Our humanities standards, our science standards, our standards in health and PE, in the standard itself, we have things like the child's demonstration of being able to formulate a question to investigate. So we've actually got those sorts of, if you want to call them inquiry skills, baked in to the curriculum. And support in what might that look like. And I think that's the conversation that we need to have around this. This dovetails with, how do we measure, how do we track? Well, it's through the dialogue that educators have around the planning table and I'm thinking very much from a primary perspective, which is my world, but where we gather together around the planning table and we have some dialogue about what we are noticing and what the sorts of things that we might be looking for, but also the sorts of things that we're hearing. What are we hearing our children reveal to us? So our assessment, if you like, and our evidence of growth is very much built around the idea of the pedagogy of listening and the capacity to notice, to analyse and to document, and then show that evidence of the emergent understanding and the emergent skills that the child has. And we can, for the most part, actually backmap that back to the curriculum when we have to. I don't think it is as complicated as it sounds if we have a view of ourselves as the inquirer. If we are constantly asking ourselves as teachers, what are we noticing? What is the child revealing to us? How are we documenting that? What are we seeing? How might we use the information we're gathering from, Ron Richard and Mark Church have this lovely quote in their 2020 book, The Power of Making Thinking Visible, where they say, we've got to start it. There's this shift now that has happened where once we were so focused on getting the stuff that was in our heads out and into kids' heads. And now our way of thinking about the art of teaching is that it's so much more about spending time getting what's in kids' heads out and into our heads. And when we think about it like that, it becomes more straightforward to find, if you like, evidence of how children's thinking and understanding is growing and changing over time. So I think if you understand the pedagogy itself offers you the data, and data is a drawing, data is a transcript of conversation, data is something the child has made, data is any information that is available to us to evidence learning over time. And I think when you understand that pedagogy, it's a little bit square peg in round hole with the language, but if you understand the pedagogy, you have evidence of growth. You can measure.
Yeah, I love Ron's work, and he was actually on one of our events here in the community, and I also love that line. I mean, I use that line in our work, how do we not just get what's in our head out to the kids, but get what's in their head out so we can build on it, reinforce it, correct it if need be, those kinds of things. And I'm gonna encourage any and all of you, if you want to press the little button, the hand down below, or unmute. I'll do the awkward teacher wait time thing if I have to, and have that awkward silence. But while you're formulating those questions, one of the things that it certainly can't be a unique thought. I'm sure many have thought about it, but it struck me fairly recently. One of the things in sort of thinking about the challenge of measuring the outcomes of inquiry and the ways in which that kind of teaching approach has value is that it doesn't necessarily, like when we're talking about that sort of direct instruction, surface knowledge kind of thing, that is fairly immediate. Whether it maintains and how long that memory will stay in their brains is another question. But the sort of opposite might be true for inquiry, right? We we sometimes, I think, see and forget that we will see, if we continue to work on this with kids over time, a sort of residual effect that will accumulate. I mean, I think about myself as a thinker and a learner, and how that some of those things that crystallized as I developed, my brain developed, and I had more experience, and was able to then put some pieces together well down the road after K-12, certainly after university. And had I not had an education and parents who, really pushed inquiry, those things may not have happened. And of course, that's never measurable in a school because it's well after the fact. So that strikes me as something that I think is an overlooked piece of that. So,
of course, I mean, we don't know. There's so much about measuring that is beyond us. So we can't know what, as you say, that much more slow-moving, gradual building, particularly around ways of being, character, how you approach life, how you see yourself as a learner. I always think of it as there's so much of what we do that's like compost. It's you're laying down compost that is going to bear fruit much later, and you have to trust that that's the case, as it is with parenting. That so much of what we do as a parent bears fruit well down the track. And it's the same with the deep work that we do as educators, and that's why it pays to have a school with a shared philosophy, because there's some kind of repetition and congruence of the way that educators talk with children, the way they position the child, the agency that children have through the day as they move from year to year in the school. That really builds up that sense, I think, of the child as an agent in their own learning. And I must say, I do see it in schools. I was at one of my favourite schools. I've been working with them for 10 years in Tasmania last week. And the sophistication of those year sixes' capacity to talk with you about their learning, and about not just what they've learned, but about how they've learned it and what they're currently working on as a learner, and what they're trying to strengthen in themselves, their recognition of the areas that they need to work on, and also their engagement with concepts and conceptual understanding. I mean, you walk into those classrooms and the stuff that's on the walls is, it's words like adaptation and interdependence, and the kids can talk about what they mean, and they can talk about how they connect to across learning areas. So, and that starts in kindergarten, and the teachers have this common way of being. I mean, they're all very different, but there's a really beautiful shared philosophy. So you do see the compost, if you like, bearing fruit even while the children are at school, because of the consistency and the dialogue that the educators continue to have with each other to ensure that there's a consistent story about who the children are and who they are.
Jill?
Kath, it's so lovely hearing you talk about all this stuff. I was thinking, I just wanted to start by saying thank you for giving many definitions to inquiry, because I think it's such a complex landscape that we live in, and I sometimes get discouraged by the either or way that people respond to inquiry. Either it's evil or it's really romanticized. So it's on either end of the spectrum. And I think in my daily practice, I see the really messy middle of inquiry. I see the really messy, complex, and I think that mixture of both, and I see both the explicit teacher, I see both the facilitator teacher, I see all of those things coming together. And the thing that really strikes me is that what you need is a really competent, capable teacher. You need a teacher who's willing to be lean in to fail as well, like to take risks, and not to romanticize. So I think in the same way we need to resist that notion that I don't know what it is, but this love of facts that seems to be in the heart of so many teachers and so many people, actually, not just teachers, is, oh yes, we love inquiry, but we keep coming back to, but let's make sure that they're learning facts along the way. No, I'm not saying facts are bad, but there seems to be an unusual obsession with fact finding that people sometimes will justify inquiry if I can show how inquiry got them still back to the facts, because that's really the essence of what we want to. We just got there a different way.
Yeah.
So thank you. That's the first thing I wanted to say. So
Can I just quickly add, because I think while you've said that, and then I want to come back to you, but one of the things that's so interesting, I've been actually returning to, in some workshops, returning to that basic, Lynn Erickson structure of knowledge to show people, okay, yeah, facts. You can't actually you can't get to conceptual understanding without, first of all, like I can't understand something about the concept of adaptation if I'm not exposed to some case studies from, say, different plants and animals that have adapted to changing environments. So that's your fact level. It's helping people understand that the facts are the first step. It's that it doesn't stop there, and that's not much use to you to know a bunch of stuff. That's easy to gather that information in. It's not much use, and also you can Google it. But apart from that, it's the teacher's role then to facilitate and work with kids to help them make connections between those facts so that you get that lovely higher order conceptual understanding. So I think it's both and, isn't it? It's like, yep, go for your life, go gather that information, but if you can't then synthesize that and be able to generalize from what you've learned, your depth of understanding isn't there yet.
Yeah.
And that's what a good teacher, a teacher that understands that process and understands how to, the kind of strategies to help kids make connections and go beyond the facts. Now, I still see it. I see teachers doing lovely things like sending kids home with a bunch of questions to ask mum and dad about what life was like when they were little or something like that, bringing them back, pasting them in their inquiry book and moving on. It's like, but that was just the first bit. That's the beginning. Now we need to look for patterns and we need to share, and then we need to say, so what? And so I think you're right in terms of the sophistication of the pedagogy. I've been thinking a lot about this lately and, what it takes to really be competent. This is a complex pedagogy. It's way easier to be didactic. It's way easier just to stand at the board with Google Slides. This is demanding, but I think the obsession with facts, it's fascinating, but it's also, that's the lower level stuff. That's the easy stuff. Yeah. It's the pedagogy that pushes those up into the land of big ideas, both for 4-year-olds and for, older kids.
I think we sometimes get wowed by cheap fact rehearsals. That's a really dodgy phrase, but I'm trying to think of what I'm saying. I'm like, I often see people saying, but wow, did you hear that so-and-so knew this about dinosaurs and they knew this about that? But the thing that I think is really interesting is we need to be asking, well, do they understand that fact? So there's a really big difference between being able to say a fact about a dinosaur. And we had this is our preschoolers, or our youngest, and there was a particular child, or he's still with us, and he knows an enormous amount. And it is remarkable. It is a remarkable amount of facts about dinosaurs. But there was then a provocation set where there was a mini world in one of our preschools with a volcano and some different things. And there was an invitation to take that further. But what was interesting was, by accident, this stereotypical fact of ideas that comes out of cartoons and different things, that dinosaurs live near volcanoes. So we, in a weird way, took what we thought was a fact we knew, or as a teaching team, brought it back to children and reinforced this idea that it's okay to know facts even if they're not real. So there are a whole bunch of things that we say that we know. Like the better example of that probably is, I remember talking to some of our year ones once, and they were saying, well, and someone presenting their amazing, oh, that's precipitation. We were talking about rain and they use the word precipitation, but it's that teacher that's able to say, do you know what that means? Like, can you talk about that concept, as opposed to celebrating with the child that a word? Like, so it was a really good beginning. I love what you said about it was the beginning, but it was just the beginning, because we actually want them to come away knowing, what does precipitation mean? What is actually behind that, rather than here's your gold star because you could use the word. You match the right word with the right teacher question,
Yeah. And much of what I'm seeing in some of the translations of this notion of the science of learning, I think, sits at that low level. I think that a lot of the justification and the here's what works, here's what works if we want kids to be able to give us a bunch of facts on a test or an exam. And but there's a different, what works, the answer to the question what works is different if your aim is conceptual understanding.
So the goal has shifted. And I think that not enough of that gets talked about in inquiry learning, that we're actually aiming for a different end than we used to be aiming for. And so if you take on inquiry learning as a new how, but you don't change where you want to get to, you can kind of treat inquiry learning as a new method towards the same end. But I think what you're talking about is something different, and saying, actually, we have a new end,
a different
way of going, because we have a different destination that we're trying to get to.
And Jency, I want to come to you, but I think, I love, again, I'm going to refer to what Guy says, both in his more recent book about the myths of teaching, but where he says, even in the blog post I referred to earlier, and he says, we can't, this question, best practice or what works, or, here's what you should do. You actually can't have that conversation until you establish for what purpose. So if someone says to me, oh no, but we know that the best teaching is this, is the best teaching for what? So if your purpose is the best teaching for kids to be able to quickly be able to do a test and get better results on a test, maybe pouring stuff into their head for the short term is the best practice, if that is your goal. But if your purpose, and I would argue, I agree with you, Jill, I think that my idea of what school is for has shifted. I mean, this is my 40th year of teaching. When I think back to what my idea of the purpose of school and the purpose of my job was in 1984 is very different to what I now see as the role of school, and and therefore what I thought of as inquiry back then is very different to what I think of now. And we're constantly evolving. We're constantly, those goalposts, that for me anyway, they have shifted. I think for others maybe they haven't, and that's where we get the clash. But
Jency, I want to pull you in here, but I did want to say a couple of things, because one, I put a link to the most recent conversation with Ron Richard, who talked about before, but I also will put one in here in a moment, a blog piece that I wrote about inquiry teaching and what I think traditionalists get wrong, and maybe it's helpful. I actually was having a conversation on Twitter/X recently, and of course, it was about rows versus seating and groups and things like that. And of course, the science of learning, people say you must sit kids in rows, and so I said, well, that depends. And so somebody said, how would you put kids in rows if you had only one choice for the entire year? And I said, it depends. What's my outcome? What am I trying to accomplish? And it was such a really interesting conversation because it illuminated that exact mindset, which was, okay, so it's a ninth grade algebra class, and assuming that most of those are, pretty heavy on math facts, and one could make the argument that rows might be the best, but I said, well, just because that's the title of the class, doesn't mean that we have to assume that that's the case. There's some other ways and some other academic outcomes, and the person was they were so frustrated with me, like, how could you not think that rows would be? I was like, well, it just depends, and rows very well might be the best choice, but you can't assume that until you know, Kath, to your point, what it is that we're after. Right. And I also make that point, the point that you're making, like, we want to make sure, and I think it's a valid criticism of some folks who are on that sort of constructivist, progressive inquiry education mindset, that sometimes they do forget or sort of downplay the role of knowledge and facts and things. You say, okay, let's make sure that we are doing that building of knowledge and using that in service of the deeper and transfer learning,
of understanding.
Of all of those kinds of things.
You can't get there without it. Otherwise, if then you've got understanding, but if you can tell, if kids can't give you examples, so they might say something that sounds very conceptual, and as soon as you say, oh, that's really interesting, say more about that, or I wonder if you can give me an example of that, or where would you find that? It's like, then it's as hollow as I'm just giving you a bunch of facts too. They all work with each other, just like explicit direct teaching is part of the mix when we bring an inquiry stance to our work. It's just not the dominant practice, it's that.
Jency?
You've been very patient, Jency.
I know. We've just been talking and talking.
Actually, my question is related to what we've been discussing. This comes from handling grade 5 for a long time. So in my class, when they're with me, I'm at the stage of pushing them to the Cambridge or the MYP. So with PYP, they have the time, they enjoy what they learn, and we stop to reflect on why I'm learning what I'm learning, and we do give them the opportunity to express in a lot of different ways. And then there's a quick transition, and now there's a lot of there's the teachers and the curriculum, basically they're more worried about how the child is expressing the understanding. I feel there's a transition between from enjoying the learning process to the kind of word choice. Is the child able to define energy in the words that is expected? So is there a way we can bridge this? I often, we have to engage in conversations, very long conversations with the grade 6 teacher who's introducing the MYP, and it's often like they understand, they are interested in exploring a lot of stuff, but they don't know to define things, is what I hear about my students after I send them off. But I wanted to understand, is there a common ground that the PYP5 and the MYP1 teacher can agree on?
Well, you go to a conversation that's been happening for my entire teaching career, which is about we have the one that is the transition from preschool into primary school. There's that conversation that is ongoing. And then there's the conversation from, I guess I'm just talking about primary to secondary. You're talking about PYP to MYP, which is same thing. So in most IB schools, the secondary starts at year 6. I do know that there are schools, IB schools, that are working really hard at the moment to bridge that divide between the MYP and the PYP. At least there's shared language with the approaches to learning and the learner profile attributes. But I think where it falls down is often the structure, of course, in the secondary setting of the separate subjects and so on. we were actually having this conversation when I was at the school in Tassie that I mentioned, Tasmania, sorry, that I mentioned before. And our primary schools finish in grade 6, and something we're really wanting to do is the grade 6 children at this school, in the last term of their last year in primary school, they design, a bit like the exhibition in PYP, they design and create their own journey of inquiry around something that is important to them, but that is also something that will that we say it needs to be something that you think will make a difference or a contribution to the world in some way. So they build these really beautiful inquiry-based projects that are a way of exhibiting, here's what I can do, here's me as a learner, and they talk about how they've learned and the skills, the learning assets that they've demonstrated. Anyway, it's beautiful, really strong, like the exhibition is. What we need to do is get those, the school that most of these kids go to, you can literally see the high school from the primary school. But we need we do a lot of, let's get the grade 6 kids to go to the secondary school so they can see what they need to transition to. We need to do more bringing the educators from the high school into the primary school to say, here's what they can do. And so rather, it's so often the other way, transiting to rather than building on what's happened here. So, excuse me. So that's what we are trying to get happening more this year, is come and see what the children can do, come and see the way and listen to the way they can talk about their learning and their deep understanding. And wouldn't it be beautiful if we were able to have more pedagogical conversations between those, in your case, year 6 and year 5 educators around the planning table? You know, I think just hearing the different ways that we talk about, you know, the strategies that we might use to build those understandings. I think that transition should be easier in a school like yours, and yet it's still a challenge. But getting those year 6 teachers to come invite them to the exhibition, Jency, and get the kids to talk about their learning.
Well, I know we're getting short on time here. There's another question, and I wanted to note, and Jill, you were talking about the sort of, I guess, orthodoxy or dogma that people approach this with. It's either or instead of this sort of yes and or both and kind of mindset. But maybe this is helpful. Maybe it's completely non-helpful, but I've begun to, and I've on our podcast, I talk with folks, you know, Kath and Ron Richhart and all kinds of folks who are in the inquiry world, but I also talk with Paul Kirshner. I'll have Carl Hendrick on, some folks on the other side of that sort of debate to try to have better conversations and learn more and be actually curious, right? But I've also been going to use the term somewhat pejoratively, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, the science of surface learning, and feel free to use that at your peril, but it seems to be a bit appropriate. So the question that I was wondering about, and I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts on this, but especially you, Kath. One of the things that I have been talking with teachers about when I work with them on inquiry is making a distinction between what I call intentional inquiry and intuitive inquiry, and the intentional piece being something that we're really planning, right? So we're using a question formulation technique, or one of Ron's making meaning protocol or something like that, really putting things in place, or maybe using project-based learning or whatever it might be, those intentional planning pieces that we can do and architect. But then the harder thing, I think, and perhaps in some ways more important, is that intuitive piece of sort of having that perception and knowing as a teacher, you might call it the art of teaching versus the other being a little more science of teaching, of, okay, how do I know in a moment when to push a little bit more, when to pull back a little bit more, when to give a little bit more information. I'll explode the heads of some of the science of learning folks and say, productive struggle, allow some of that to happen. And knowing how to do that, when to do that, that. And I'm curious if you make a similar distinction or use different language. And then how do we build that intuitive piece? Because the intentional piece, I think, is, you can do these exercises and activities, right? Here's a book and you can do this.
I would say it's all intentional, right? So even when I'm being responsive, so there's the projected work that we do where we might set things up, where we've got a particular resource we're using or a particular strategy, but then within those moments, I've got to position myself as responsive. So a lot of the work I do with professional development is like literally teaching. So I'm in the fishbowl teaching while other teachers are watching and listening. And we always have a conversation beforehand about intention. So what are the intentions when moving into this lesson with? But then our conversation afterwards is so often about what emerged. So, and I think the emergent piece, the responsive, the intuitive piece that you're talking about, Drew, which I agree, I think that's the essence of teaching. The essence of teaching is not, there's the script, I'm going to go through the script regardless. It's about, I've got an intention. I really have a strong sense of the big ideas, perhaps the skills, etc. What is it that I'm taking in? But then there's almost a contradiction. It feels almost contradictory to say I'm taking this in and yet I am open to something else happening that changes the direction. That because with the pedagogy of listening, the noticing, the work that I do to stay present, my intention helps me then manage the more intuitive moment. And so for me, it all feels intentional, because in that moment where I'm thinking, oh, wow, that thing that kid just said, that is fascinating. I'm going to lean into that. I can see the other kids have really, I wasn't expecting that. All right, where might we take this? That's intentional, isn't it? That's the moment you're saying to yourself, right, let's go with this. So you've got this constant dialogue in your head, and I think it comes with experience. So when we do this work with the learning labs in my schools, some of my beginning teachers are just like, help, and my reassurance to them is that trust in yourself and the trust in the children, that takes time. So I think you do a lot more of that. I'm going in, I'm doing the thing, and I'm managing, I'm just kind of staying on top of the classroom management thing. That's early in the career. And then if you're committed to a more learner-centred and learning-centred approach, gradually with experience, I'm sure you agree, Jill, that gradually the delight of that intuitive, responsive way of working kicks in, and that's when you feel you're actually being a teacher. That's when I feel like I'm being a teacher, when I allow my intuition to drive me, but the intuition is absolutely dependent on a sense of intention.
Yeah. Well, I would agree for sure. That intentional piece sets up, and you want to be intentional about providing and doing and building in those things that provide for those moments, those teachable moments that we're all after. Okay. And so it comes from experience, and I'm an advocate for, if I were running a school, I would at least try my best to give teachers opportunities to engage in inquiry experiences and discussions and dialogue and things that perhaps weren't even in pedagogical in nature, just to get that experience, right? Because we're so busy teaching and planning and, wiping noses or whatever teachers are doing at whatever grade levels, that you can just not have time to do those kinds of things. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to focus on in our work, is how do we build that skill set for teachers to be able to use that intuition, that perception,
Yep.
and be able to demonstrate that artistry of teaching that is really rewarding, not just for students, but is for teachers as well.
Yeah, and you need time. It's the gift of time for educators to be able to gather around that table and engage in dialogue, and ideally be able to be with each other when that teaching is happening, so that you can hear it, you can see it, and then you can talk about how it worked. The minutiae of the moves that we make. I think that's where you grow as a teacher, is when you're in the space with other teachers. And ironically, the way a lot of schools are set up means that you don't get to see and hear other teachers doing this beautiful work, and being able to do it together or listen in and then talk about it. That's where the magic happens. That's where you learn.
Yeah. Can I ask just one more question? I know we're over the allotted hour. One of the more fascinating conversations I've had on our podcast, and this was, I'll put the link in, it was with Art Lazander, who is part of a group of researchers, and they wrote a piece that was based on their research of the case for combining inquiry with direct instruction.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. And it's really great. We had a great conversation. One of the things that he's written about and they've written about that I thought was really useful, and I'm curious what you recommend for scaffolding and differentiating an inquiry, because just because kids are curious doesn't mean they know how to engage effectively in inquiry. And I think that's a really overlooked part of that conversation, right? Just like they may not, we need to scaffold all kinds of things in terms of building surface knowledge or those kinds of things. We also want to do that with inquiry skills, and recognize that some kids are maybe not as far along, so they're not quite as ready for as much autonomy. So curious how you think about that and what you recommend for those scaffolding pieces.
Well, I think it's so important that, I'm just thinking about the lessons I did last week, and one session I was doing with some grade 5 children who are doing, actually it's the class that's investigating this concept of adaptation in Tasmania, and one of the case studies they're looking at is they're investigating what's happened to this little animal called the Tasmanian devil, that is an endangered animal and really important to Tasmanians and Australians in general. And anyway, long story short, we were watching a little video to find out more about the role of scientists in helping monitor the progress of these animals. And in order for the children to gather the information from the text, they really needed to work on how to notice when the information was relevant and to document that relevant information. So for me, the idea that this is where that very explicit nurturing of those skills was so important. If I'd just gone, okay, kids, we're going to watch this video and that's going to help us learn more about the scientists and what they do. So watch the video and then we'll have a chat about it afterwards. That would be really poor instruction. That might have looked like I was being an inquiry teacher. Oh, well, let's find out. But what I needed to do was really tightly scaffold, and we did. We kept pausing. I posed the question, how can we document relevant information when we are viewing a video? And then we had a few ideas about it at the beginning. We watched a bit. We pressed the pause button. The kids turn and talk. Let's compare how we're doing. How have you done it? Can you show us your notes? Right? I could step in and go, you know what, if you tried this technique, has anyone thought about this? Let's try that. So actually positioning the children as not just inquiring into the content and the concepts, but those skills that you do need. Yep, you can be really curious, but unless you know how to get the most out of that text and to document what you're getting, and that requires a skilled teacher's scaffolding. I don't have to model it and didactically teach all of it. I can still get the kids engaged and inquiring into the skill, but I have to make it explicit. So I couldn't be in more agreement about the need, the blend of, if you like, that very kind of tight, explicit piece with the bigger picture of let's investigate together. But the investigating together has to be supported. It's why I guess the last thing I would say is, there's often people making distinctions between there's guided inquiry and open inquiry and free inquiry and blah, blah inquiry. Certainly from a primary teacher's perspective, it's all guided. It's guided. Of course it's guided. The level of guidance, it's like a piano accordion. It's in and out. I'm bringing the guidance tight. I'm opening it and maybe guiding less, standing back a little bit more. But my role is always there to guide the process and the skills. And I think that's where we meet more in the middle than we realise when we're having these pedagogical conversations. We have probably more in common than we think.
Well, now Amy's raised her hand, so I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, honor this question, then we'll get out of here. So, Amy, go ahead and unmute, and let's hear what you have to say.
I apologize. I know that we're over.
Okay, Amy.
I'm curious about something involving parents. So our school is very new, and these parents are coming from places where it's not as inquiry based. How would you recommend communicating that with parents, or that process, and having them realize that the process is a lot different from learning on just a basic level? How do you create that trust with them? That's been my biggest challenge this year.
That's it. I almost feel like I want to throw to Jill, because your school is relatively, are you having a similar thing? Or are parents choosing your school because they know that it will be a more progressive environment?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it helps when your school backs you up in terms of we're really explicit with who we are and what we do at school tours and the information. So we hope that a parent comes to us knowing kind of what the experience is that they're engaging with. But I agree with you. I think that we too often forget the importance of parent participation and sharing with parents. So we try. It's a difficult era, I think, because I don't know if COVID's affected it, but we've had a lot more difficulty getting parents to come out to school in the evening and to engage. So we've started looking at how do we offer meetings or ways for parents to have a window into the sophistication. And I think that's something that you touch on in that maybe accidentally, is the importance that we need to make visible. I mean, I know that's almost like a catchphrase in inquiry, but I mean it from the point of view, not just making the process visible to the student for the sake of relaunching, but making the process of learning visible so that we see value, because we see the visibility of process, because we can't always measure in the old data-driven ways, but we can tell the story, and the story is really powerful. So I think we need to find ways to tell our story, or get children or students, depending on the age that you're working with, to how do we, and even giving that problem back to your students. Like, we want to talk to your parents about the value of what we're doing. How could we do that together? What could we do that would bring them into the story? And I don't know, they're just some ideas off the top of my head. But
yeah. And I think that idea too of, when I think about some of the really great project-based learning work, where the emphasis with that kind of approach is very much on taking action, real purpose, real audience outcomes. So where the kids are actually producing something that is going, I saw a beautiful example recently of grade 3 kids that they'd been investigating the living things in their school and community environment, including the birds. They got right into the bird life. And then they made this set of what bird is that cards. And then they produced them. They were like commercially produced. And then that whole process and the careful drafting of the cards and the skills and the dispositions that the kids demonstrated while they were doing it, and then giving those out to other schools in the area and local shopping centre. And I just think if we can think about also with our journeys of inquiry, if the children are producing something for real purpose, real audience, we start to bring family community in a little more. It's like, how do we make this work more public? Like you say, how do we tell our story? What is it that parents can see and that the community can see about the worth of what we're doing? And if the documentation and the visible sharing includes, this is where I think the rubber hits the road, includes the language of the skills and the dispositions that are being demonstrated through those tasks. Because most parents, when you ask them, they want that for their kids. They want them to learn to be critical thinkers. They want them to be able to develop those skills of collaboration and so on. So the documentation, yeah.
Can I throw something in you reminded me of, I guess, was also how important it is for you to be confident, Amy, like of why you're doing what you're doing. Because I think that when we know the intention and where we're going and we make that explicit, and I think don't ever apologize for it. Like even though you face confusion, don't apologize. Be like, oh, fair enough. Let me take you down this road. Because I think sometimes we so want to make a bridge to parents that we first apologize and accidentally we undermine what we're trying to do. So be confident with what you're doing and just know what you're doing and be willing to. You probably already do that though. So I'm probably, but it just reminded me brand new. So
yeah, but it's that professional. It's like I'm a professional. And I want to be able to like you say, this confidence in expressing the why and saying, oh, yep, on the surface it might look like this, but let me tell you what this moment. So these kids that are sitting around making a train out of cardboard boxes, I'm going to explain to you what's really happening here, and the skills that the children are developing. And yeah, I think that's a really important point, Jill, feeling competent and confident in our work.
Well, Dennis is making me a liar, so I promise if we can honor Dennis's question and make it brief.
And I need a second coffee, so...
But I will add, Amy, one thing that it might be helpful to the extent that you can have these conversations with those parents is what we do sometimes is to try to have an anchor of like, what's your ideal graduate? What are those characteristics, traits, and attributes that we want to make sure that we're producing in our kids? And I think as Kath or Jill or both of them said, parents want those things that inquiry can help with. The other thing that I would say too is, and I think this is important, it comes with the confidence and clarity, is that it's most likely that their concern is, well, are they actually going to learn stuff? Are they going to perform well on tests or whatever? You say, well, because the way that we're teaching an inquiry doesn't mean that we're not, addressing the facts and knowledge and surface things. It's a yes and so some clarity and maybe in examples, sort of Kath was talking about, like, here's what's really happening, right? So that they understand that it's not just, making Pinterest worthy, or I guess TikTok worthy now is a better way to say it, TikTok worthy kind of things that look pretty and are fun for the kids, but what are they learning? So those kinds of things I think can maybe be helpful. So Dennis, question, and then I promise we're gonna get out of here because I have to go as well.
Yeah. Actually, it's not a question. I was thinking into Annie's challenges right now. So my previous PYP coordinator was trying to convince some parents, because there were parents in my previous school that having questions about how we run our programs, because most especially those parents who are very result-oriented parents, so my coordinator was asking the teachers to bring, and I was assigned to teach the parents on how to run the ATLs inside the classroom. So they didn't know that I'm bringing them to how we run the program in an inquiry based in the classroom. So we invited them a fortnightly thing. So it was a fortnightly thing in my previous school to really engage the parents that this is what we are doing in the classrooms of your kids, aside from inviting them to see the evidences of what we have. That was an idea of my previous PYP coordinator. So they started to embrace the whole thing, and I'm so happy to see them trying to support their kids at home. That's why we told them that teaching is not only a one-way thing, it's a three-way. two here, two in the school and one at home. It's like the thing. Yeah. That's all.
Lovely.
Thank you.
That's lovely. Yeah, we're in partnership together.
Yes.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Well, that's a really wonderful place to wrap this up. And thanks to all of you who have joined, and Kath for giving us the time and a little extra. The book is, if you're not familiar with it, From Agency to Zest. She's got other books as well. I don't know how many times you've been on the podcast itself, 2 at least, maybe 3. This might be 4. I don't know. I've lost track, but it's always a pleasure. And again, thanks to all of you who have joined. And Kath, if you have any parting words or things I want to say, we have two websites. WeGrowTeachers.com is our professional development site, and you can see all kinds of blogs and podcasts and our PD there. And then, of course, you all are familiar with ThoughtStretchers.org, which is the community. So, Kath, any last parting shots?
No, just thank you for joining. And thanks, Drew, for having me again.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bye.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.